Good evening, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming to this ÖFG Peaceful Change lecture event. It actually won't be much of a lecture. For the most part, it will be a discussion. And the discussion is going to revolve around this book. It comes in two different shapes and forms. One is the soft cover, much nicer because it does have a proper cover. and and here's the hard cover. It's something that Corneliu and I put together actually in the early days of the Corona pandemic, and I remember discussion with the publisher at the time, and he said, "Oh yeah, it's actually very timely because we had this video conference." And everything was suddenly much more digital, even much more digital than before. It's an edited volume, and so we wrote introduction and conclusion, and we had a number of really fantastic scholars helping us out with individual chapters on a range of issues. And today we want to discuss a little bit about the book with you. And we have a fantastic facilitator for that task, and that is Brigitte Krenn, who sits next to me. She's the Deputy Director of the Austrian Research Institute for Artificial Intelligence. And by the way, that institute is about to turn 40 years old.
Whoa.
And that's really amazing, right? So that you see that is actually very, very visionary, right? If 40 years ago someone created an institute like that, that's actually very remarkable. And Corneliu Bjola, I think I've invited you several times here already, so perhaps I don't even have to introduce you in major ways anymore, but he's associate professor at Oxford University at Queen Elizabeth House, highly innovative scholar, especially on digital diplomacy, digital international relations, and I think caveat from my side straight away, if you look at this stuff, then the digital, that is really, for the most part, Corneliu. And the agency and order, perhaps a little bit more me, but we'll see how it goes in terms of our discussion. We've presented a brief overview of the book. Corneliu is going to start about 10 minutes. I'm going to follow up about 10 minutes. And then Brigitte comes in, asks us questions, and also invites you then as the audience to join in. The whole thing is probably going to take about an hour, 15 minutes. Okay? So then, Corneliu, without any further ado.
Thank you very much, Markus, and very happy to be back here. I remember about 10 years ago, we had the first lunch, and that was the volume on diplomacy, theory, and practice. That we co-authored, and to our surprise, it became a success in the sense that it sold out very well. We got the second edition in 2018, a Chinese translation recently, and now happy to announce that we're going to do the third edition. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because it took place here, the launch. So when Markus said, "Where are we going to do the lunch?" he said, "We're going to do in the same room because the room did very well for us." So we'll hope the new book will have similar success. But what I like to say a bit more along the lines of what Markus suggested, that this is the first probably volume, I think definitely is the first volume, trying to take a very close look at the intersection between digital and international relations. And as Markus said, this is, in essence, a thoroughly digital book because it was done from the beginning to the end in digital ways. During the pandemic, we had the first workshop, 2 days workshop actually on Zoom. It went on very well, I think. And it tries to look at how international affairs are changing. And there is a question behind it. Why this book now? And I think I was very lucky with Markus to start thinking about the topic at that time, because I think it's becoming inevitable to think about international relations from a digital perspective. There is a question here in the sense, how to reflect on that. So the book includes about 12 chapters. Markus is going to say a few more words about these chapters. We have the introduction and the conclusion, but the introduction and the conclusion are not the usual introduction and conclusions, because the introduction and conclusion actually tries to set out a direction for thinking about two things. One is what is called digital international relations, the practice, what people are doing outside this room, right? International affairs, we think about governments, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, international organizations, the practice, people conducting international affairs. So we try to put together a framework for understanding, a lens, a theoretical lens for understanding what is happening outside the room. And we have three different components, and we try to use these components to understand key concepts in international relations. Power, security, right? Are these frameworks, realist, constructivist, liberalist, still valid? Or we need to amend what is new, what kind of digital layers can be added, the role of the state, knowledge that we have in international relations. And that is particularly important, right, when you try to understand who the actors are. So the introduction tries to make, to provide the lens, a theoretical lens for understanding what is happening outside the room. The conclusion takes a different view. We try to understand what happens in the room meaning the discipline, us studying what's happening outside. So from this point of view, the last one, it provides a map for understanding how the discipline that we contribute, we theorize, is going to evolve under the impact. So there is this kind of connection that we try to make, outside and inside. There is a connection between them. So that was the ambition. And in between these two chapters, we have this contribution. Markus is going to cover them a bit later. So what we cover usual stuff that people study in international relations. We study security. We study economics, digital economies, which are likely to become even more important than traditional economies. Human rights emerging in a particular historical context. But the historical context is changing with digital technology as we know it. Right? We talk about privacy. What is privacy in the age of AI? There was an article that I spotted today in Financial Times saying that the Danish scientists have put together an algorithm to predict the days of our death. So that is going to have some other important implications in terms of social cognition, but also religion and so on. What about international law? Is it up to the task to do? And we see this kind of struggle that in the case of the European Union, but not only, trying to catch the dragon. Can be the dragon, the digital technology, be tamed, or we need a different type of framework. So aside from this, we introduce new topics. Of course, there is the issue of algorithms. Algorithms have become such a powerful mechanism in our life. We talk about civil society and advocacy networks using digital technology to raise awareness in different ways. Digital games. It's interesting when you talk about, right? It's not only simulation, but the way in which metaverse and other environments are evolving. So that's a little bit of that. But going back to the question that I wanted to highlight is why now? What is happening out there that makes us think that this kind of book is important? And I think we have to really reflect on this concept of digital age. People talk about it very casually, right? Different terms. What we try to do in the book is to unpack the concept. What exactly we mean by digital age? Technology has been around in different forms and shape for a long time. What is specific about this period that we should pay attention? Let me highlight three elements. One is, of course, the issue of data. We have digital, If you look at your phone, it's not the hardware. The hardware is important, of course, but it's the data that collects from you on a daily basis. What do you do? Who do you meet? How do you schedule a program? What kind of things you read? All is about data in that little box that you have in your hand. So it's a lot of data that is being produced, and it's something unique in terms of the volume of data, and that is challenging for us. How to deal with the huge amount of information. Our brains are the same like 1 million years ago. We have to process the data differently, and that challenges us. We can go with this kind of volume of data, all kind of predictions, but look at the rate of expansion. So for comparing with 2016 to 2003, we have about 10 times more data that is going to be produced. What kind of data? You say it's about our lives, real data. But guess what? We're getting smarter. We have also synthetic data that is likely to become even more important. What is synthetic data? Is data that doesn't exist in reality, that is being used by AI and others to simulate. So data that we produce, we create out of thin air, in a sense. But the point we're making synthetic data is because it simulates or it resembles the real data. So it allows us to do research and advance our thinking. Is that important? Of course it's important. This is why we have a new field, data geopolitics, about information security. What are we going to do with this data? Data has to be absorbed, taken, stored, processed, analyzed, right? And then decisions are taken based on that. So data has become important. This is why, for instance, concepts like data sovereignty has started to emerge. Data agreements. If you go back 20 years ago, nobody concluded the data agreements. Sometimes when I want to have fun, I ask people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who is in charge with concluding data agreements? And they look at me like I'm from an alien world. But data agreements have become quite important. I know, I have to move faster. So data geopolitics, so data has importance. It has importance on our life, our society, but now it's creating geopolitical reverberations. We need to know how to negotiate this data. Data agreements, EU has concluded about 6 or 7 data agreements with Canada, with New Zealand, with Japan, and a few others. And the point was, you, a company from Canada, can do business in Europe as long as your regulation in Canada is compatible with GDPR. That's the conclusion. This is the rule. EU has concluded one with the United States, but guess what? Someone here in Austria, the famous Schrems case, overruled that. They took that to the European Court of Justice, and they said, well, US national security legislation is not compatible with GDPR. So there is a little bit of tension there, diplomatic tension, which didn't exist traditionally, right? A second element, which I think is characteristic to the digital age, is the question of speed. Or you feel that there is something fast happening. When we start talking in 2013 about diplomacy, the first volume, we didn't touch on digital diplomacy because the term didn't exist. That started to emerge later on. But now a lot of data is produced very fast. That comes from a quote, at least, Eric Schmidt, former CEO of Google, mentioned it. 90% of the world data was generated in the past 2 years alone. That's a lot. If we look at the tech adoption, Facebook, launched in 2004, reached about 100 million users. It took some years. TikTok in 3 years, Instagram in 2 years, ChatGPT in 2 months. Tech adoption. The phone, the landline phone, took about 75 years to reach the same number of users. So there is this kind of acceleration that we see with technology. We come back in 5 years, I don't know what we're going to talk about in terms of things. So acceleration is driven by technology. The 3G, the 5G, people started talking about the 6G. It's in terms of the speed of the and that's challenging for many in terms of processing, accommodating to this kind of rate of change. Poses challenges also at the Rosa Hartmut has a very interesting book, a German sociologist, on this topic, the question of the sociology of speed. What she says, very interesting argument, that in our societies we have areas that adapt easy to change and others that adapt slower to change. And that creates, cleavages in the society. So what is speedable, what is less speedable? And we can use this argument to apply to international politics, right? What kind of countries adapt well to this rate of technological acceleration, and which one are left behind, right? What is speedable and what is not speedable in international politics? Why is that important from an international perspective? Institutions. Most of our international institutions are from 1945. Rules, norms, are they still up to the task to adapt to these kind of conditions? Or not? Do we need new institutions? Are these word institutions still relevant in this context when you basically chase the development from yesterday? People try to develop regulation for the EU Act, right? I don't know. By the time the implementation, the bird is far away. So the speed is the second. And the speed makes challenges on all institutions at the level of the state, at the level of international organization, whether we are able to adapt. I'm not trying to be pessimistic here. I'm trying to understand how this new factor affects the way in which we try to process. And the third element that I think it's important when you think about digital age is that it's everywhere. It covers everything around us. What we read, as I said, how we schedule, how we go around, Uber, boarding passes, everything. So, and there is a question here, how much reliance we now have on this data. We noticed, for instance, during the pandemic, how much dependent we became on technology. Buying from Amazon, right? During imagine that pandemic taking place before the digital age, how difficult it would have been without the Zoom, without the Amazon, with all the other technologies that makes us easy to overcome certain crises. So there is a question of how much information is becoming not only critical, but hypercritical. It may be a matter of life and death. Now we have the wearables, the watches, the whatever, that takes the pulse. Our health is dependent. If you don't feel well, there is a signal that is sent out automatically to an ambulance. It's pervasive and is intrusive in our life. More or less, there is a question of being always on. We spend so much time connected to these devices, right? From the moment we wake up. I mean, for instance, now it says that more than twice, 24 hours a week, we are online. It's changing us, isn't it? In terms of individual, in terms of personalities, becoming more. And we see this kind of explosion. People started to use the term Cambrian explosion. Cambrian, 500 years ago, as you know, there was an explosion of life on Earth. And trying to explain what happened, people say, well, there was an increase of oxygen in the air, or who knows. But there is this kind of feeling that we reached a point in which what we've seen before, it's on the brink, that we're going to see more things connecting, developing, whether it's about Internet of Things, blockchain, quantum computing, you haven't even touched that, NFTs, virtual and augmented reality. So more and more new applications. That creates divides, of course, big divides. We already have divides, geopolitical divides, no question about it. But when you look at how many people actually don't use anything of technology, and maybe they don't benefit from that. So there is a big, which might not be, what I mentioned in this is might not be that the digital divide overlaps with the traditional divide. The question that I think for us, and we have a couple of chapters in our book, is what does it mean for power and governance in international relations? I think we know international relations being a state-central institution. This is how it emerged, Westphalia, and so on. And then you have, political economies and corporation. What I think will be interesting to see in the future with this kind of how power is changing. Is Elon Musk the sign of things to become beings of powerful individuals with a lot which comes from technology that can shape a lot of things around him? Musk, if he wants to interfere with the war in Ukraine, as it happened, right, he can shut down the Starlink, and that will have an immediate impact on the conflict. These are powerful individuals. They may listen to their states or may not listen to the governments, right? Is that what we're going to see in the future? More Musk, and how we're going to negotiate? Is the state giving away its power, not only to corporations that we've seen in the past, right, in the 80s and 90s, but do we see the rise of the nerd individuals, we called in a party? And that's what I wanted to highlight in terms of why this book is important, because if we have certain undercurrents, rivers of digital transformation that affects us in terms, as I said, in terms of the data politics, in terms of how institutions, if they are up to the task, but also how this power is being reshaped and diffused to different actors. So now, Markus, I think you want to say something about the rest.
To Corneliu, thanks a lot. And now the question I want to discuss is, what are we actually making out of all of that? Much of what Corneliu said about these technological processes, you could go now into all kinds of different directions with that. So you could do research probably on the environment, on health, on all kinds of things. And obviously what we are interested in, given our profession, is international relations. So in what ways then do these technological processes, in what ways does this digital era impact international affairs? And that is obviously a very, very big question. And all we do in the framing chapter is we delineate how one can go about answering that question, how one can go about tackling that question. And I don't have to say now much about the technological processes because Corneliu has done that already. But what we're also interested in is what agents make out of these technological changes. Are they really interested in these changes? Do they put digital technologies to use? Why do they do so? Are they not at all interested in that? Do they simply want to continue the old ways of doing things? What happens when actors meet where the one side is actually very digitally savvy and the other one is not? And we look at that in a very, very broad way. So we don't want to be the realists or the liberals or the constructivists or the critical approaches or the post-structuralists or something like that. Yeah? But we look at the major agential processes that we find in international relations and probably in the social sciences more broadly. And that is, first of all, the stick. So it's forcing other people into doing something. So to what extent does digital technology change that? And Corneliu had an example about that with Elon Musk, for instance. Yeah. So modern warfare is digitalized already to a very considerable extent. And Elon Musk, a private individual, more or less under control of the US government, who knows, yeah, obviously has a role to play in there. So has a role to play in this forcing element of it. There's a lot written in our field and way beyond about cybersecurity. Yeah, that is probably the burgeoning field when it comes to digital international relations. That also, for the most part, focuses on this forcing mechanism. The second one is not about sticks, but it's about carrots. It's about enticing. It's about the interests of actors. That probably is quite important for state and non-state actors again. Yeah, so not just for state actors. Yes, they pursue their national interests and everything, and diplomats obviously are very much instructed to pursue their national interests, and they probably have to do so using digital technology also in terms of fostering their own digital tech industry at home. Yeah. So one of our next project, Corneliu and mine, on tech diplomacy, we're going to do a workshop in San Francisco about it. It's basically about how traditional diplomats and these tech firms, how they communicate with one another, yeah, how they make something happen with one another. And probably for the most part, the kind of mechanism that matters there is the enticing one. It's about the interest. And the third big mechanism is, very broadly speaking, winning over. So we often hear that now, so through social media channels, that realities are made. There's all kinds of talk about fake news, about echo chambers and all of that. So meaning is made, and obviously social media very, very important in that way. Yeah, and both of us did our doctorate in Toronto, and one of the great thinkers associated with the University of Toronto was Marshall McLuhan, yeah, communication theorist. And McLuhan had this famous distinction between cold media and hot media. So the cold medium for him was television, and the hot medium was the radio. So he thought kind of hate messages and all of that travels way better over radio than over television. Yeah? May actually be something to that if you look at history of genocide and all of that. But what about the digital age? What about digital media? What about social media? What kind of role do they play? Early on, we thought, they can be actually very democratizing, and so it's a kind of deliberative tool, and there was the Arab Spring, and obviously that already had quite a bit to do with digital technology. And but when we look at the issue in our days, and we're probably a little bit more pessimistic, yeah? So obviously authoritarian governments very much put digital technology to use, to influence in very, very subtle ways. We have massive media conglomerates globally where actually one person, be it a Rupert Murdoch or someone else, can actually shape public opinion in many countries in very, very critical ways, oftentimes interacting on the one hand traditional media, and on the other hand the social media. They feed into one another. So much about these agential processes. Now, if these agential processes are being put to use over and over, then they sediment into some kind of order. Yeah? And order is not a particularly complicated term there. Yeah? So we are actually quite orderly now in a way. So you sit on your chairs, and there are these rows of chairs, and even if you would strongly disagree with what the three of us say today, you would not come up to us and punch us into the face or something. So there is an order. Yeah? Some of it is visible, and some of it is not that visible. So the rows, for instance, that is visible, this kind of deeply ingrained understanding that you're not going to come up to us and punch us into the face, hopefully. That is invisible, yeah? So that is what we refer to as a background. So these are the two dimensions of order that we look at, foreground and background. So foreground are those institutions in international affairs that are designed by actors. So the United Nations Charter, for instance, is very much designed by actors, and so are any kind of legally binding instruments, compacts, and what have you. Yeah. So international law, for the most part, is about the foreground of the order. But there are also all kinds of backgrounds of order, and sometimes these backgrounds, they can clash in all kinds of ways. Yeah. So let's say, going back to my example with communication between traditional diplomats and representatives of tech companies, they really speak very different kinds of languages. Yeah? So the diplomat is educated to be a generalist. And every 4 years somewhere else. Doesn't really get deeply into things, has a certain inkling about how to foster the national interest, what kind of means to use for that. Someone who represents a tech company is much more versed in actually tech. So the kind of background knowledge is very different. Probably also much more versed in kind of accumulating wealth and in terms of fostering the interest of the company, of the multinational corporation, as opposed to any kind of public good. So our book looks very comprehensively at these agential processes and at these ordering processes. And we are not linear in our thinking. So on the one hand, yes, the technological processes, they do something to agential processes. Yeah? So certain technology is available, and some agents, some actors put them to use, make use of it, while others don't. Yeah? And obviously, so let's say you're supposed to take care of the national security of your state, and perhaps you're a Baltic state, and there's a big neighbor somewhere around, and that big neighbor uses all kinds of digital technology to try to destabilize you in whatever ways. Then you probably have to respond to that. So you're probably gonna make use of this ever evolving repertoire of digital technology yourself. And if that happens over and over, then that will have certain effects on the order. Yeah, that can have effects on foreground and background. In terms of background, we probably have, if I stay on with the security example here, we probably have an evolving order. Yeah. So where there are some kind of tacit agreements that you don't go full blast in terms of your attacks, perhaps a little bit similar to conventional warfare in the past. All very nascent in terms of an order. When it comes to foreground provisions, much more complicated. Yeah. So because there is no agreement actually what an autonomous weapon system is, and for the most part that is probably by design. Yeah. So that I think great powers are quite heavily involved in stalling any kinds of disarmament, arms control efforts with these contestations about the definitions, which is the foundation for any kind of agreement to move on. So on the one hand, then from technology to agency, from agency to order. But obviously, once the order is infused with this digital element, then it feeds back to agents. Yeah. So perhaps at some stage for diplomats it will become quite natural to do teleconferencing and all kinds of things. Perhaps not in order to reach the final agreement on a deal, but perhaps in the early stages of negotiations. Yeah, that would be then a change in the order. So you would do diplomacy differently. And all of that can also, via agency, then have repercussions on the technological processes again. Yeah? So if digital means become more and more important for actors, even for the order, then these actors may actually exert pressure on tech experts to develop certain technologies further. And those certain technologies, perhaps in the military domain, but obviously also in other ones, yeah, that can then feed back into the agency and into the ordering processes. So much about the general idea of the book, and then we organized it obviously along the line. So that's a table of contents now. along the lines of how Corneliu and I sketched now the book content. So we start off with our framing chapter, and you've basically heard now the gist of it. And then we have 3 chapters that deal with revisiting core concepts in international relations. And there obviously are quite a lot of core concepts, but power is probably a really important one. And what does it actually mean, power in the digital age? So realists, of course, Kissinger recently passed away, were all about the balance of power, right? So classical realism, at least, all about the balance of power. What does that actually mean when digital technologies are involved? Can you still have a balance of power, or is that the end of it? That's a question that Harknett deals with in depth, and he actually argues balance of power days are over. What about the state? Can the state still assert itself, digital sovereignty? Or is it the state more and more eclipsed by non-state actors, by networks, by what happens transnationally? That's a question that Kello asks, and he's actually quite optimistic that the state is gonna continue to assert itself. What about this nexus of authority and power? So that's probably the best chapter title, the nerds, right? Corneliu talked about this already. So these experts, they suddenly become very, very important, the tech experts. And so if you have the capacity to design a certain algorithm, then probably there is some authority, there's some power coming with it. And that's an interesting argument, right? Because that would mean, okay, so it suddenly actors, these digital nerds that have power, that have authority that previously they did not have. Agential processes, so this link between technology and agency. There we also have 3 chapters. There's one on trust in digital space. I think that's a fascinating chapter on basically on diplomacy, teleconferencing, and what gets lost if you move from in-person negotiation to Zoom and to teleconferencing. And it's a very empirically founded chapter that does find that quite a few things get lost there. Yeah, so that reaching agreement in terms of negotiations becomes actually more difficult. The human element is no longer as present. There are problems with trust and so on. Metro diplomacy, a chapter on how cities link globally. Because if you think about it, digital technology obviously very much centered on cities. Some cities with a kind of massive presence of tech companies, San Francisco in particular. What happens if these cities simply connect, leaving out traditional diplomacy? So they don't necessarily need now a foreign ministry to link up with one another. And then a chapter on transnational advocacy networks. To what extent do they make use of digital technologies, the social media? To what extent does that change around how they try to affect international relations and how they try to affect negotiations? And then we move to ordering processes, and with these ordering processes, we look at certain functional orders in international affairs. And we obviously look at security, we look at economics, we look at the environment, and then there's a broader chapter on international laws that basically summarizes what we refer to as the foreground of international order. You could obviously link now all of these bits and pieces in these chapters, and to some extent we do that in the conclusion, to big questions about international order. The liberal order, for instance, to what extent Does digital technology help to defend the liberal world order? To what extent does it actually stand against it? Yeah? That's perhaps a question that we can discuss then later on. And eventually we're gonna we wrap up in the conclusion, and there we don't look at international relations as a subject that we study, but we look at international relations as a discipline. And we compare 3 different strategies for moving beyond what we have now. The one we call upgrading, so basically leaving the discipline as it is, different perspectives, different paradigms, but factoring in the digital. We're a little skeptical whether that's gonna work, whether digital international relations can work like that. Augmenting means to really redo the discipline much more fundamentally in terms of analyzing international affairs. That's a perspective that that's a strategy that we endorse. And rewiring is a normative side of things, and obviously there are a lot of important normative questions about this digital international affairs as well. And if you want to write about it, then one probably also has to move quite a little bit beyond the confines of international political theory that we encounter in our days. So sorry, our overview was too long. We're probably too excited about the book. I leave it there, and I'm gonna hand over to Brigitte, who's gonna guide us through the discussion now.
So thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, so that I'm here. I'm glad to do this organization of the discussion. So are there some pressing questions, comments, remarks from the audience? Oh yes, please.
Good evening. My name is I'm a professor with the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy of the Brussels School of Governance at the Free University of Brussels, and currently a visiting professor with the Department of International Relations at CU here in Vienna. I have actually 2 questions. One is a question related to power, and the second question is a question related to security. The first question related to power, and this was hinted at in the presentations, and the rise of corporate market power and the big technological giants, and how they control from data, critical infrastructure to talent, and the huge budgets they have to push forward innovation in emerging and disruptive technologies. And AI was mentioned, big data was mentioned here. And whether international relations theory has the proper conceptual theoretical tools to understand their international relations role or geopolitical role. We are currently listening a lot to discourses about dissolution of the world order, the rise of different power agents, non-state, or decentering the state-centrism of international relations. And how do you see this power being manifested, and how it also reconfigures, in a sense, public-private relations? And another issue related to, and this is again a question related to the security, the second one is exactly this emergence of a new military commercial complex that we are witnessing. The war in Ukraine has given us a couple of examples, but of course these processes have been happening for quite some time now. This rapprochement with Silicon Valley, again, corporate giants, in terms of developing lots of interesting and potentially lethal technologies, and how security can be thought of from a technological agency perspective, and not only agency perspective, meaning that autonomy is increasingly leveraged now in terms of, again, power projection and the pursuit of big defense budgets. Thank you again for a very interesting presentation, and actually look forward to reading the edited book.
You can continue. Do you want to continue together? Because they're usually an active lot.
Okay, so
2, 3 or so at a time. Yeah.
Yeah, here and then here and over there and there. So you just start. Yeah. Whatever. Let's be pragmatic.
Hi, my name is Reed McIntyre. I'm a student here at the Diplomatic Academy. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. Earlier in the presentation, it was mentioned that 60% of the world's population has internet access, or should I say only 60%, as well as an emerging discrepancy between nations who can keep up with the increasing rate of technological change and those who can't. And my question is, do you view that there is a risk of parallel systems emerging between these two groups, as in nations who can keep up with technological change at the same rate as other nations, or as well as have the infrastructure to maintain this, and those who cannot?
Okay. So there was over there. And you.
Hello, my name is Anne-Roos Verpers. I'm also a MAIS2 student and also one of the organizers of the DASICon, which is the conference that's organized by the DA students. And we're talking this year about new and emerging technologies and their influence on international relations. And in the preparation for this conference, I've been doing quite a lot of reading on especially artificial intelligence. And one of the issues that keeps on coming up is the issue of trust, and specifically how this works between, on the one hand, state actors, then the tech sector, the experts, but also the people in general. And I was wondering how you see the influence of trust, or the influence of technology on trust between these three actors and how this is distributed. Thank you.
Okay, here. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Mansur, also a MAIS2 student at the Diplomatic Academy. I had a question. If we look at the AI development, it is excessively growing. The question is because there was also a summit in the UK and there was a declaration on the AI security and opportunities where the US, China, most of EU countries were involved there. Now the question is that considering that also international order or the liberal international order is under immense stress, on the other hand, the geopolitical rifts between China, US, and also including other major powers is growing. Can we expect that there will be any sort of new treaty on the AI and also related to the security, because it's also securitized enough, and it's also in the wake of this excessive growth of AI, how likely is that going to happen, or we will see a new convention on that, or no, or it's like far away? Thank you.
Hi, Nina Tannenwald, Brown University, and I'm a visiting professor here at the Diplomatic Academy. So you did a very nice job of laying out the questions of your book and the approach, and I'd like to ask you what you see as the most important finding of your book, the one or two most important findings that we as readers would take from your book. What is your main conclusion and argument that we should take away from the book? Thanks.
Okay, done. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Victor. I'm also a MAIS2 student here at the Academy. My question is kind of related to what Mansour said, but in a more general terms. So we have in general so few truly universal agreements and treaties, negotiations of which come through with much painful grind over each line and thus take usually huge lengths of time. So far, climate issues, for example, which were on the table well before the digital issues, still did not get a truly sound universal agreement or a dispute settlement system. Are we to see the same with digital regulations, or will the dynamic nature of digital environment provoke also a more active diplomatic involvement of global actors?
Hello, thank you very much for the interesting talk. My name is Benedict. I am a recent graduate of the Diplomatic Academy. I'm interested in the effect of cyberspace and the pervasiveness of the digital era on other security issues, such as, for example, nuclear deterrence and nuclear norms. It's a field that, next to cybersecurity, has gained traction again with regimes such as Russia and North Korea increasingly again making use of nuclear weapons as a power currency. And my question would be, do you see the expanding cybersecurity field as a stabilizing or a destabilizing force on, for example, the nuclear security field? Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Raphael Klausnitzer. I'm one of Professor Bjola's students in one of his courses that he teaches on digital diplomacy. And I would like to continue on one of the questions that were raised regarding artificial intelligence. Do you agree with me, or do you think that artificial intelligence will play an important role in this year's number of elections that are going to take place? And what, in your view, is the most important role of AI in these elections? Thank you.
Just pass it on to your neighbor.
Hi, my name is Ann-Kathrin Rest. I'm also a second-year student at the Diplomatic Academy. And I wanted to ask about digital negotiations regarding the threat of leakages and how far that kind of shapes or may decrease trust and the type of information that is shared and discussed, specifically classified or more delicate information, and whether that may also reduce the efficacy of negotiations. Thank you.
So, more questions?
Maybe second round. Yeah.
Okay, so let's give the audience a break and let you two answer.
Corneliu, do you want to start and pick up whatever strikes your fancy, and then
I can start, and I mean, the question of power is fundamental to international relations, right? I mean, this is how the field was established, trying to understand what power means, and I don't know whether, we've done a very good job. There are different theories about how to understand power in the pre-digital stage. Power was, at least, for a big chunk of our theorists, was very much material, very much related to soldiers, very much related to economy, that you have economic power to sustain the population, the industry. What is power nowadays? Is the same thing or not? And there was an interesting article in Foreign Affairs, I think it was published last year in February, and sort of I like it. Because it came up with an idea. I said, power at the digital age has, yes, might be relevant and traditional concept, but power at the digital age, it's all about innovation. Do you have power to innovate? If you have power to innovate, you're going places. You're going to stay with your head above the water. If you don't, you're going to fall back. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because you say, well, power to innovate. How do you sustain innovation? We have different models. We have the American model. American model is the government doesn't interfere. It creates an environment in which companies thrive. We have the European model, which is more centralized, tries to stimulate, companies to do. We have the Chinese model, which is very closely connected, the economy and the state. Which one is better? I mean, if you look, for instance, at AI, there are two players at the moment, United States and China. Europe is not big in this game at the moment, AI. Maybe it will change, because the AI Act that was just passed tried to eliminate national barriers, so the market, European market, will become bigger. But that's interesting, power to innovate. What it takes for you to innovate? You can have population. Is that enough to take this kind of result, to obtain results? What we find, speaking about some of the findings, I mean, going a little bit, in the security chapters, is that there is a fear that some sort of the Chinese model is going to prevail. Because there is this kind of competition. Even in the United States, there was a recommendation done by the AI Council, I think, led by Eric Schmidt, which I quoted, in which they recommended a more concerted effort between the government and tech companies. Just think about it. Do we really want tech companies and the government to come together, as a force? You may say, well, in a very competitive environment with China and the others, that might be the way to go. But when you put together this kind of combination, we probably going to go in a different type of system. So I think power to innovate is becoming particularly important in the context of the digital age. Of course, innovation has been around for a long time in different ways. But probably now, because of the constraints that I mentioned, the fact that you have to run, speed, you have to run very quickly, very fast, faster than the competitors, right? And then you need to find a better solution to stimulate this. This is what I think, there's a discussion nowadays about on this. So it's power to innovate. How does it translate in terms of influence? I think that's a separate question. You can innovate and shape an environment. We talk intensely in international relations about international order. What is international? It's a pattern of interaction between international actors, states, international organizations. But shall we start thinking about digital international order? Because I think it's a pattern of digital type of interaction between actors, which are not always visible. So where are we going with digital international order? And you see the signs. I mean, they're already on the wall. There is this kind of more liberal digital type of order. There is a more authoritarian. There are not too many options in between in terms of digital international order. And the technology, there was a paper published in International Organization, I think 2 years ago. The technology that we develop has an interesting inbuilt bias towards a more authoritarian type of regime. That was an interesting idea. You create technologies that you can surveil the population better. And why do you surveil the population? Because you need the data that stimulates, the process. But also, so there is a concern that the type of technology that we developed sort of blocks a little bit or hinders the way in which we think. So we have to be worried about this in terms of the direction we're going. Power to innovate is not neutral. We have this innovation in mind because it's a myth of innovation, that it's always progressive, it's always liberal. I'm not against innovation, of course, but we have to think about how innovation and the technology that we build are affecting our system, or is pushing us in the direction that is different. That takes me to the second point about digital divide. How to deal with digital divide? We had digital divides before, right? Internet penetrations in various countries, and we see nowadays, emerging on the question of AI. I mentioned already there are big players and others less so. What does it mean? And I think here the question that we see is that on the digital divide there are different layers. Even when we think about AI, we like to think about this algorithm, the ChatGPT, that allow us to process text and do all kind of things. But behind that layer, it's a second layer. It's not only the human layer in terms of the talent of the people to understand, the tech nerds to understand, to write the algorithm, but deep down, before the tech, is a digital infrastructure which relies on critical natural materials. The EU just passed the EU Act, and Ursula von der Leyen was talking about passing a new act next year on critical raw materials, which are critical in the sense, in this phone, you have so much resources that are not present in Western countries. 80% of the things that go into this phone come from China. And that, it's a little bit puzzling, right? Because you can have the brilliant algorithms, but if the infrastructure is built on things that, in terms of the digital competition, digital environment. So I think there are more layers to the digital divide that we have to pay attention. Not only to the top, the one that it's think about the algorithm. And these digital divides are not necessarily mutually reinforcing. In Europe, they discovered some critical materials in Portugal, I think, and Sweden, and also in Austria. Austria, by the way, I think on lithium. But that clashes with what? With the environmental policy, right? Because in Europe, mining is no longer a big favored policy. So you see this kind of, even if you discover, then you have to rethink some of other policies that you decided actually to remove from your agenda. So it's a more complicated issue with the digital divide. I think the plus on this is that it's more easily to recover in terms of digital. Digital generally has been seen as a level playing field. And I had the occasion to witness that. I remember doing a workshop at Oxford, inviting various countries on digital diplomacy from Europe, from Africa. And the one that actually we learned something were those coming from 3 African governments, because they had to do a lot of work with less. And they were very creative, using these kind of technologies to take care of certain foreign policy issues. So I think it might be an element of level playing field in terms of the talent of the resources, but it's more to dig up in this digital divide than only the top layer. I mean, there are a deeper layer that seems to pull the direction, the discussion in different direction. So I'll take these 2, and then we'll come back.
And then shall I do the rest? Or I basically no. Thanks a lot for the questions. They were very, very good.
There are a few on AI, so I don't know if you. Yeah, I can go back.
I'm gonna try to link a few things together, and then you can come back in. There was one question about basically about the foreground order, right? So what are the rules? I can't remember who asked it. Mansour. So I mean, there's actually very little, right? So Corneliu obviously alluded to the EU, and the EU wants to be a regulator in that field, but many others don't, or are much less inclined. Yeah, although the trend seems to be towards more regulation. Yeah, but you mentioned the possibility of a convention or something. I mean, what's in the making is the Digital Global Compact. Yeah, but a compact is a compact. It's not a convention. So even on that level, we see that it's very, very difficult to regulate something. Nina, so basically the takeaways of the book, yeah. So I think that they really are, so these digital technologies, they fundamentally change these agential processes, and they fundamentally change international order. And it's these are ongoing processes, and they may move us even towards a scenario of hybrid agency, post-human agency, where this what we or what I always did was the agential process, political judgment or something, like borrowing from Immanuel Kant, probably won't work anymore at all. Yeah. So I think it really changes the foundations of in a very open-ended way of international relations. This brings me to answering a question about nuclear weapons, right? Mm-hmm. Because if one would apply now that, so agential processes and ordering processes on nuclear weapons and digital technologies, that's a very scary thought, yeah? Because so we do know, so probably the time where nuclear war was the closest was not the Cuban Missile Crisis, something like that. There was one incident where a bear climbed over a base in the US, that was pretty close. And another one which was even closer during the Cold War was when NATO did an unannounced maneuver and suddenly now on the side of the Soviets that appeared like a nuclear attack. Yeah, so the very early computers at the time, they said, hey, that's a nuclear attack. Yeah? And famously, the Soviet soldier in charge of monitoring the situation, he dismissed it. Yeah? He said, okay, that machine is just talking rubbish, that can't be. So the more we move, the more digital technology and nuclear weapons get linked, the less likely a scenario like that is. Yeah, so the human element is probably gonna be pushed towards the back seat. Yeah. What does that mean then actually about order? That probably would have to mean, if one wants to anticipate this now, yeah? So anticipatory security, that is Aradau's chapter in our book. Yeah? So you basically have to think of security not in terms of the technological state of today, but of tomorrow. Try to anticipate these changes and find rules even before this technology is actually being put to use. What does that mean? It probably means, yet again, to take nuclear disarmament very seriously, which of course nuclear weapon states don't do, yeah. And B, to rethink arms control if nuclear disarmament is not being taken seriously in fundamental ways. And the kind of the trend that we are experiencing in our days is the exact opposite of that. So it's a very stark example where if one takes this digital innovation, everything seriously, and with this anticipatory security, where we move exactly into the wrong direction. Yeah, so less rules, less regulation, not even thinking in terms of how rules could look like. That anticipate this nexus of digital technology and nuclear weapons. Although we are in the midst of so all nuclear weapon states are in the midst of massively revamping their nuclear arsenals. And one more thing about elections. Who asked that question? Elections you can manipulate, of course, in many different ways, or referenda you can manipulate in many different ways. And one thing, obviously, that we've learned from the Brexit referendum and all of those things is that because of datafication, it is much easier now for campaign managers to understand what the kind of hidden assumptions of the audience are, so what the prejudgments of the audience are. Yeah. And then based on these prejudgments, you can actually make a campaign. And say the Brexit vote, so the public opinion data, they were, I'm simplifying now grossly, was always basically since the 1970s, basically always a third. Yeah, a third in favor, a third against, a third don't know. And if you have this kind of thing as a campaign manager, you don't know. Why that's interesting, right? Because then that means you have 1/3 of people who are undecided, so you can do something with them. And if you know their prejudgments, then you can really direct that into certain directions. The way how we think of elections in democracy, obviously they have to be free and fair. And free and fair does not only apply to the actual making your cross and dropping the thing in the ballot box, but it also extends to the electoral campaign. Yeah? And that's yet another big question. Yeah? So with massively new tools, a whole new toolbox available to campaigners, what does it mean in our days to have free and fair elections? Yeah? So what is still admissible, and where does manipulation begin that is completely irreconcilable with free and fair elections?
Just to continue a little bit, so on the question of findings, so I mentioned at the beginning like 3 different drivers, the question of data, speed, and pervasiveness. So when you look at different chapters, what came out quite clearly as an important factor is a question of speed, influencing a lot. The chapter of HARNET, for instance, HARNET idea, it's all these cyber defense weapons are driven by this concern about the other side being faster, you have to anticipate, you have to develop your capacity with an eye. So that accelerates. Of course, it increases the possibility of accidents and so on. And also, that's one reason, interesting, that he said that balance of power, the way in which I understand it, it's almost over. So speed was an important factor that we see also, with the Aradel chapter on algorithmic governance, the way in which to try to anticipate anomalies and try to think about them. Pervasiveness, not that much yet. There is a little bit about post-human agency and so on, pervasiveness, the fact that we are surrounded. And I think it's a lag effect. You may see more about how this may become more integrated and the facts. Or maybe we got adjusted to this kind of new environment. On the question of nuclear weapons, I don't dare to, especially with the number one expert here in the room on nuclear weapons, on nuclear taboo, but I think it is likely to have a destabilizing effect. There was an interesting paper I read a few weeks ago, which was recently published, with an algorithm that actually developed to predict which country is more likely to go nuclear. So if you have this kind of tools, how is that going to affect the entire dynamic? Right? Because you know who is more likely, then you're going to put more pressure on that. The other country is likely to develop faster, try to hide. So I think it introduces some interesting destabilizing effects in this very fragile environment that we see now on the non-use of nuclear weapons. In addition to that, it's a scary scenario with autonomous weapons. I don't think at the moment, I haven't heard anyone on to delegate control of nuclear weapons. And there have been a number of publications on that, delegating control of nuclear weapons to an AI, because AI is not good at the moment for this. But who knows? With this kind of development and speed of reaction. So I think it's more on the destabilizing side of it rather than on the more obvious. The question of trust, do these technological tools, how does it affect trust in international politics? I mean, the chapter from Holmes and Wheeler say, well, mediated negotiation by Zoom and teleconference, they have limitations because, people cannot. But in a different article that I published last year, in which I surveyed about 105 diplomats, I also asked this question. I say, well, online is difficult to start a relation, but it's easy to continue a relation. So the point was that offline you can develop and then you can continue. So it's not that, trust is intrinsically absent. from mediated relations. That on the point of distrust is the following scenario, is that I'm online and I do a negotiation and all what I do is being recorded, put into algorithm, and every blink of an eye, can betray an emotion. Is that science fiction? It's not. An algorithm can read you, we know that already from social media, right? There have been studies like, 300 likes make the algorithm know you better than your spouse. So that is done. This is why we have micro-targeting. But on Zoom, if we are negotiator and, everything about you, the way in which you speak, the way in which you, betrays, reads you, then, do I want to enter the room of a negotiator who has this kind of tools next time? Because I already enter with my hand behind my back. So there is this kind of power asymmetry. So that's one element in which, speaking about, again, digital power. So in which you have technology, basically you can be able to read more the position and to find more opportunities for the negotiation than before. In the past, the negotiator finds through experience, through good teams. But now I think with technology may be able to, and that affects, right? I mean, what kind of trust, you can have with someone, with a party that actually, has more capacity to understand you and your team, and also to what extent, you are supported domestically back home. I looked at a study, I think, a few years ago with the Iran nuclear deal. Very interesting, because in international negotiation, there is a famous theory, Putnam's two-level game. And Putnam's two-level game says that whatever you negotiate at the international level, you need support at domestic level. Otherwise, if they don't, then they cannot ratify. Example being Brexit, right? Brexit, Theresa May had a beautiful deal in Brussels, but he couldn't ratify back home. Boris Johnson goes, beautiful deal back home, but it was difficult to ratify in Brussels. But what we looked at the case of nuclear deal is that now it's easy to interfere in the domestic, speaking also about location. So you have an international treaty, and then through social media, you interject yourself in the information space of another country to derail or to mess up the discussion, the sharp power, right? And that's this is why during Obama administration he had actually to develop capacity to talk with the American public to defend the deal. So that was interesting, right? In order to protect the domestic level against intrusion, but also the Republican opposition. So I think you see that more. It happened before, and I think in terms of negotiation, the capacity to shake up perceptions in the domestic level are more likely, right, with these kind of tools, and create more distrust on international negotiation. And finally, the point: are we going to see AI treaty? I don't think so. Yes, we have a meeting, in UK. There are kind of cooperation initiatives. Biden spoke with President Xi, trying to find, some agreement. There was also the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council between the United States and Europe. I think these are good efforts in which they try to identify shared risk about how to think about AI at the global. Are we going to have I think that the advantage of AI, it's so important in terms of influence that probably will be difficult to get something like what we have, the non-proliferation nuclear deal, 1968 or so. But maybe I'm pessimistic. A little, though Mr. Kornprobst is more optimistic than me. So
I used to be. I'm no longer.
There is an arm race. And that's the competitiveness of getting. It's probably the worrying one. Maybe I don't know. Yeah. we'll manage, to get through.
Is everybody satisfied with the answers? Furthermore, questions? Still? Comments? Tiredness? Worries?
No, good. I think then we can.
We need a positive vibe to finish. We cannot finish on a negative.
Yeah, but it's no longer the 1990s. No, I mean the positive vibe that for me was Brigitte. Actually, that was you at some stage, because you said that you always emphasized that artificial intelligence, in that case, but it can really go both ways, right? So that it's
yeah. So I always say it's us, what we make out of it. But I think it's so fresh, it's so new, and the pace of changes is so immense. So I started as a person who did not even have an internet access, because I'm too old to start with it. So I did my diploma thesis kind of on the typewriter, and so I'm transcending. So coming from the past and seeing the last 30 years of work, what had happened and what's happening, and the acceleration is enormous. And with this ChatGPT being everywhere now, a reason why it is everywhere now is because it's about language, and it on the surface works quite well. And everybody understands language, because everybody is kind of an expert in language, because we all have our native languages. And I think that was the reason why, with the ChatGPT being made public, everybody got enormously alerted. There were other large models. They started with vision, and nobody really cared. So DALL-E, for instance, it was there for quite some time. Somebody was playing around with it. Most of the people ignored it. But ChatGPT wasn't ignored anymore, because it was about language. Everybody is proficient with language. And I think that the problem also is that at the moment it's Wild West. We don't really know where it will go and where we will go as humans, because we need to think about what is reality completely differently. So when we are sitting here, the three of us, and we are seeing a number of people in the audience, and we believe that you are there, and that you are not holograms, and that you are not deepfakes. But as soon as you go into the virtual, we don't know anymore. And as you said, there is a negotiation. You don't know what technology the other one is using. You don't know how you are analyzed. But on the other hand, the other one does not know what you are creating and generating, and that it's not being you really, but it's already a generated image, which is generated specific signals. So it always goes both ways. So there is something used for the bad or for the good, and there is another technology which works against it. I think it's all very, very human. I was thinking, we had this social media and echo chambers and a lot of hate in the internet. And I was thinking, why is it so massive? And I think the massiveness is because we have this acceleration, we have this extremely multiplication due to the possibilities of the internet. So if we're sitting there, just 5 people, and being really hateful about something, who cares? But if we are sitting on a computer, being just one, but with the algorithms, finding similar people, finding the bubbles and bringing those together, it's exploding. And again, it's like a magnifying glass on us, what we are doing. It's not new. It's just enormously magnified. And that's why we have to think about what does it mean to be human and to be in interaction. And I think technology will not save us, and it will not destroy us. Well, yeah, okay, nuclear, if you have nuclear weapons.
No, you have to adapt, right. No, that I like this, this idea. I think probably that will be the next target or the next thing that we have to think, the reality, exactly what you mentioned. What we think about reality nowadays, I think technology gets to the point in which you can actually create multiple realities. And people really stick to those realities. Just to give you an example, it's a separate study that I'm conducting right now on virtual reality related to Ukraine. As you know, in Ukraine, this war is not only about territory, it's also about culture. Russia is destroying a lot of cultural institutions, museums, and things that are important for the Ukrainian identity, trying to erase the past. Right? The war is also about erasing the past of Ukraine. So what in this study that I'm doing now, I'm using virtual reality because Ukraine, despite all the war, it's aware of this. And they're trying to rebuild those institutions in virtual reality for two reasons. One is that church was destroyed. We're going to rebuild it physically later. We rebuild it now, but at the same time, it's not about rebuilding, but allowing the visitor to go through the cultural art institution, because by going through, you interact with it. Your memory becomes, you reflect on that. So this is a mode for Ukraine using virtual reality. There are 3 different films that I ask my students to look at, in which it's cultural defense, trying to protect your cultural identity. But here comes the twist. If you can protect that, you can also erase it, right? Erase history of countries in these kind of things, right? Which are becoming very immersive. Iran has been trying, they have a special department doing this, trying to recreate a little bit of the history in the region. So reality, what counts as reality, will be interesting to see that line between what we feel, that we know, and what is that world that technology is going to project on us. So the social media was, the first one. But I think it's something important here, and I think theoretically and also reflexively for us, to understand the dawn of the new age, the positive and the negative, and how to adapt to it.
Yeah, and one more thing, maybe then we are done. It's a promise. I think that oftentimes we risk of digital being always branded as something bad, and that becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, if we always say everything digital is about cybersecurity. And with cybersecurity, everything is really very, very dangerous and Then obviously, the digital gets narrowed down to cybersecurity, and it's a very narrow thing. It's a normative statement on my part. If we do research on perhaps on cyber peace, yeah, then it's a different kind of lens, yeah, and it puts a positive spin on things, yeah. I think that sometimes we as scholars also make this mistake, that we always think in terms of really bad scenarios, and that may obviously have certain reality effects in itself. Yeah. And I had to make this comment now because this obviously is the ÖFG Peaceful Change lecture series. So there has to be something about peace. Thanks a lot, Corneliu. Thanks a lot, Brigitte, for being here. Thanks a lot for your questions, and I hope I'm going to see you soon in this lecture series again. Thanks.
Thank you. So that's it.